Hello and welcome to yet another podcast with the Carbon Circle. So, with us we have Dan Maleski. So, Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for
Hi.
having me.
Right. So, me and Dan today are going to touch upon a very interesting topic again, which is around CBAM. So, today we'll touch upon a topic, the cost of the carbon borders, financial impact, and the burden allocation in CBAM. In the due course of the podcast, we will be roughly touching upon four broad topics, but mostly centered around economics. So, the first topic that we'll touch today upon would be the burden allocation and the financial flow. How is it going to impact? It is largely meant for the CFOs. The second subtopic is around India's financial exposure and the market distortions. The focus area here is India specific data, MSME vulnerability, and the real market impacts that are already underway. The third topic for today that we'll touch upon is India's policy response, the CCTS, as we know, which is the carbon credit trading scheme and the negotiation strategy. We have already signed an FTA with the EU, so we will have a discussion around that. The last topic is the financial and the strategic response. So we understand that the CBAM is permanent. So we will also look at how India's policies are going to look at it and how the burden shifting is happening in this very space. So these are advanced topics when it comes to CBAM, and Dan here is an expert in the field. So Dan, we'll begin with something simple, right? Maybe a quick introduction to what you do at Redshaw Advisories, and how does your everyday look like?
Yeah. Once again, thank you very much for bringing me on and having me. It's a pleasure. I lead the CBAM risk and hedging team here at Redshaw Advisors, where predominantly we help companies who have to pay this cost of carbon. They're exposed to it, and because the cost of carbon is so significant, this cost changes structurally how they do business. And
Mhm.
so we discuss the risks of what that looks like, how this cost is going to evolve, the strategies they can use to manage this cost, and many other fun topics in that realm. And predominantly, that's going to be working with, let's say, a hedge fund who's looking at how CBAM or the EU ETS imports impacts their equity positions, or a industrial who's looking at how CBAM is going to impact the premium of their HRC imports. Maybe it's a government looking to respond to CBAM, or a private equity company looking to acquire a company, a cement company or steel company per se, to see, well, what's the CBAM cost going to be like for this acquisition? Is it still profitable? And so that's kind of what we do on a day-to-day basis, really in the realm of the financial element of CBAM.
How many years has it been, Dan, since you started your journey within this CBAM space?
I'd say about 3 to 4. I mean, CBAM is still relatively new.
Yeah.
The policy was only officially brought into legislation on March 7th, 2023. And so we've been doing started doing work around a year before that, setting the groundwork, the runway for our clients to prepare for this. As any quite large instrument, companies, they can't react overnight. And so as a result of that, we've been working in this realm for quite a while. But before that, our expertise and our bread and butter is the EU ETS, EU's emissions trading scheme, which broadly follows a lot of the same principles as a CBAM, which is why it was an easy-ish transition for us to get into the CBAM space. As easy as CBAM becomes, because nothing's really easy in this realm.
Absolutely. And thank you for that brief introduction to what you do at Redshaw Advisories and also the kind of expertise that you bring. Let's address the elephant in the room, the burden, the cost management, right? So let me throw at you the first question. So
Oh, go for it.
let's be precise about the mechanics here, Dan. So on the 1st of January, an EU importer receives, let's assume, 10,000 tons of Indian steel. Embedded in that steel, considering 1.8 ton, CO2 per ton, it is roughly around 18,000 tons of CO2. So EU ETS, I mean, today it is at around 78 as we speak, but I mean, 72 euros per ton as we speak. But, given that, what are the financial obligation the company would have?
Great question. And I mean, I mentioned something earlier, which is CBAM isn't easy, and this is a great example of that because it's really impossible to know without understanding the circumstances. Because if that steel is being produced BOF or EAF or DRI, we're going to have different costs of carbon. If that steel is going to be used on actual emissions or default values, we're going to have a different cost of carbon. And hypothetically, that producer potentially has the ability to have no CBAM costs at all, actually, if their production values are under the benchmark, the EU CBAM
Mhm.
benchmark. And so without knowing the specific circumstances around that company, it's virtually impossible to provide a very accurate answer. Taking a step back, if we look to broad brush, which we typically don't do with our clients, but let's say for this example we do, we look to broad brush. Let's say a client from India is looking to import steel, and they're looking to use default values. We're anticipating a cost per ton, an additional cost per ton in 2026 of somewhere around 300 euros per ton of steel. Now, given HRC and these tons of steel could trade in the range of, let's say, 400 to 600 euros, depending on quite a lot of variables. That 300 euro premium adds quite a significant premium, and so as a result of that, to answer your question quite simply, that the cost is going to be significant, and oftentimes so significant that it outprices them in the European market altogether. Which is one of the issues a lot of the Indian clients we are speaking with have right now.
That the 300 euro markup is a significantly high, given that the margins are going to
Oh,
be
it's
compressed as a
ridiculous.
result.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, the steel sector, altogether has slim margins anyways. And so, adding 5 or 6 euros on a ton of steel could be quite drastic. But imagine 300 euros.
300.
And that's why we're seeing such an uproar on CBAM, specifically on countries affected such as Indonesia and India, with very high default values. It's not profitable. It's not sustainable.
Right. Dan, for our listeners to understand this a little better, could you throw some
Yeah.
light into what is the difference between the actual values and the default values?
Yeah, great question. So taking a step back, the CBAM requires goods which are imported into the block to be measured, which are exposed to CBAM. So goods that are exposed to CBAM to be measured, have the carbon be reported, and then later potentially verified and finally procured. So following a very similar process of what occurs in the EU's emissions trading system. If I was ThyssenKrupp in Germany, I need to measure my carbon. I need to report my carbon to the EU, and I need to then verify it, and I need to buy it on an EUA, then retire that EUA. So with that kind of structure in mind, looking at CBAM, the European Commission is well aware that a lot of companies can't use the same robust reporting and measuring requirements as EU industrials simply because those systems are not set up. And so
Mhm.
they've allowed companies to use another option. That option is a default value. So instead of going onto my mill with a clipboard and looking at my oxidation factor and everything else I need to understand for my actual emissions, I can simply select default values per my tons of steel. But in doing that, you incur a punitive uplift. And so that punitive uplift is quite significant. So broadly speaking, two options to measure, report, and then in this case, have two options of exposure to your CBAM covered goods, actual emissions, which will be significantly lower, and default values, which will be significantly higher. The issue, I'm sure some of their speakers might have gotten into, is it's virtually impossible to get actual emissions right now. And so everyone is going to be dealt the hand of default values, and that default values, as I mentioned, the 300 euro premium is just so expensive, it's unprofitable.
Absolutely. So the system is built, I mean, by the looks of it, is to start with at least start measuring the carbon emissions now, so that they could start reporting on the actual values as compared to the default values, because default values will significantly increase the cost of manufacturing through the CBAM certificates itself. Dan, let me jump into put myself in the shoes of a CFO now, and let's start this. Let's start with the question that keeps keeping CFOs and the exporters up at night. When an importer buys a CBAM certificate, for the first question is who actually pays. The EU law says importers are liable, but the market reality says
Yeah,
something different. So
yeah.
walk us through how this actually plays out.
Well, commerce is very liquid, it's very fluid. And so oftentimes, let's say So legally speaking, the authorized CBAM declarant is the one who needs to retire CBAM certificates. Typically, the authorized CBAM declarant is the EU importer. But in
Right.
reality, that's just the person's, pressing the button to submit the CBAM certificate. The person who actually gives them the money to do that could be anyone. And so a very simple example is going to be our conversations with traders. So if I'm a trader in Switzerland, for example, here's the conversation about CBAM I'm going to be having. So I import 1 ton of steel and I go to my, let's say, client in Germany, and I say, hey, Mr. Client, I need to pass on this new cost of CBAM for you. Let's say it's 300 euros, in this case, Indian example. The construction company in Germany, for example, might say, well, no, 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 no. CBAM, the polluter pays the CBAM cost, not me. I'm not paying this 300 euros. It's the chap in India who should be paying for it. And so I'm the trader. Then I go call up my Indian supplier and I say, hey, Mr. Indian supplier, I got some bad news for you. If you want this contract, you need to pay that 300 euro premium because you're the polluter. And then the Indian, company is going to say, no, 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 no. This is an EU policy. I'm in India. The EU company needs to be paying for it, not me. And so you get this hot potato back and forth, and that's just a small example of the discussions and the negotiations that are required to actually figure out who's going to pay for this, because it's not a trivial cost. I mean, some of our clients are paying. I mean, as of right now, it is February 13th. Some of our clients have already paid 7 million euros on CBAM obligation, and it's only 43 days into 2026. So these costs are substantial, and it really requires a lot of negotiations, and it's not as black and white as the importer pays. I've seen circumstances vast and wide of how companies are structuring these negotiations and these liabilities, and it gets actually quite creative. So the result is it's a very fluid dynamic, and virtually anyone could pay. The importer, the trader, the exporter. We've had quite a large amount of different scenarios structured.
I mean, it's interesting that the system of CBAM itself is interesting, but it's also concerning because the markup is so high, and given that it was in the transition phase before, and now it's entering the definitive phase. A lot of the folks here in India also have woken up to the definitive phase and the changes it is going to bring along with it. And of course, now it is going to translate into real term dollars. It is making that much more concerning. But what are your thoughts on this when it comes to increase in the prices? Do you think it will add to the inflation?
Has to, yeah. I mean, we saw Northwest HRC prices increase 30 euros last month alone. And across the board, we're seeing in virtually every commodity there is exposed to CBAM, quite substantial inflationary costs. Again, you look at something like cement. It's not very value dense. So CBAM
Hmm.
costs alone potentially could double the price of cement. And if you think about it, let's say 1 ton of cement takes around 0.89 tons of carbon to create. Let's say by 2034, with the full phase-in of CBAM, one CBAM certificate, or EUA in that case, is, let's say, 200, maybe 220 euros, right? And
Hmm.
currently, a ton of cement's trading around, let's call it maybe 60 to 100 euros, right? So right there, that is, you're doubling the price
Doubling.
of cement. And cement's very hard to abate. And it's you get into these economics and you start to realize it has to be inflationary, and it's going to be inflationary. And so you look at across the board of all these commodities, it's gonna really impact prices, which is we're already seeing that today. The price of steel, the price of aluminium, the price of clinker. Um, Companies are baking in the price of CBAM into that, and it's quite substantial.
But perhaps that's a price that we are to pay if we are to fix the climate problem. Uh, so Dan, let me ask you the next question, which is even more pressing, right? So let's take an example of an Indian exporter again. So the Indian exporter in this scenario quoted this customer, let's assume around 400 euros per ton, and which was
Yep.
logged in 6 months ago. The production costs are roughly, let's say, uh, 370 euros per ton, and that leaves a margin of around 30 euros for every ton there. Now the CBAM cost itself is going to add to it. So what is their financial reality, because the margins are so compressed?
Yeah,
How
yeah,
do they work with it? And since this deals are to be done, I mean, it's not like today I get the deal done and tomorrow I start my production. There is a period, there is a timeline in between that, right? There is a fixation period, the waiting period of 4 months, 6 months, and only then the production starts. So
yeah.
how do they manage this risk?
Well, so this is where you get into various hedging instruments. So let's say I'm a company, um, I'm a company who needs to procure 100,000 tons of steel. What I'm going to do, first of all, is I'm going to secure the price per ton of steel that I'm willing to either sell that steel,
Hmm.
or my maximum price. Let's say it's 500 euros per ton. Let's say I'm a trader. I need 100,000 tons of steel. That's what the construction company is willing to pay. 500 tons, 500 euros per ton of steel. I'm going to call up, let's say, you know, someone in India who can give it to me for 400 euros per ton.
Hmm.
And hopefully that 100 euro buffer will be CBAM. And so what they need to do, first of all, is they need to lock all their costs in. So I'm the trader. I'm going to call up my Indian supplier, and then as soon as that price is agreed upon, I'm going to go and hedge and lock in my FX, my steel, of course, my freight, my everything else. And then I need to hedge my CBAM cost. Let's say it's 100 euros in this case, and or let's say 90 euros. So I have a 10 euro buffer for my margin. And so broadly speaking, you need to lock these costs in to have a chance at being profitable. Most of the commodity traders we work with, I mean, there are a few that speculate with their physical commodities. Most of them operate on a back-to-back basis, and as a
Hmm.
result of that, they're very risk adverse. And so most of them simply just look to pass the cost of CBAM on. But how do they do that? And we can get into that in a little while. But the more you dig into this, the more you realize companies are viewing CBAM and are managing CBAM the same way they manage other liabilities, which is to lock that cost in. But to do that, you have to be very sophisticated. You have to understand what that CBAM cost is going to be. You can be confident on it. Because if you lock in, let's say, a 70 euro price per ton for CBAM, and it turns out in 6 months from now it's actually 100 euros, you might be in the red. And so these companies, not just how, this is why CBAM is so tricky, because you can't just measure your emissions. You need to measure your emissions and then understand what is the possibility of them actually being verified. All right, give me a percentage. Let's say 80%. Um, how are you going to bake in that other 20% of that potential value being a default value? Because that default value is going to increase the price per ton substantially. And so how do you bake in that risk in that price per ton of steel? And so you start getting in the weeds of this, and it gets really tricky, really complicated, really quickly. And
Hmm.
again, the issue here is the volume. It's substantial volume. It's substantial amounts of capital. And this is one of the issues we're having with our clients is, they're really not sure how they can bake in this cost, because a lot of them are just waking up. The EU has given companies 2 years during the transition period to have a runway to understand CBAM, to get the strategies in place. And most of the companies we work with, you know, broadly speaking, did the bare minimum. They just viewed it as another irritating ESG compliance acronym. I'll toss my ESG sustainability team on it. I'll comply with it, and it's whatever. Some companies just thought CBAM was going to go away because the CSRD and EUDR got watered down. So then on January, they all woke up, and we're seeing we're seeing some of our clients, who didn't really take it seriously now, and almost overcorrect, overreact, where a lot of them are not importing at all. They're not going to touch an import because they need to upskill on CBAM. They need to get a strategy going. They need to get hedging instruments going. They need to do their forecast, everything. And it's kind of a nightmare for a lot of companies.
I could understand the kind of nightmares that most of them are having, and even in India here, most of them assume that it would go away, just like that. And right now, it
And
is it is there's a lot of importers in Europe are asking for this numbers from their exporters here in India, and that's where this queries are increasing.
it doesn't
More
help. I mean,
important.
there was a news article that came out about 4 months ago in India, and the news
Mhm.
article headline was something along the lines of India gets an exemption under the EU CBAM. Same thing, we had a big headline, anyone following the CBAM space, about a month ago, the headline out of Egypt comes out, and the headline was Egypt gets a 1 year exclusion of CBAM. Um, Really, even the news journalists don't know CBAM well enough to understand No, they don't get an exemption at all. I mean, looking at the Indian article, the journalist was referring to Article 9 of the EU CBAM, which states an effective cost of carbon was paid, then a rebate could be incurred. But there's a lot of criteria for that to occur, and they just presumed that their upcoming carbon market would reach that, and therefore India would be exempt. And so when that headline went viral, and so some of my Indian clients came to me and said, "Wait, I think we're exempt now, are we?" And so, yeah, I appreciate where a lot of my clients are coming from. The information they're hearing on it is confused. They are, getting 14 different perspectives. The EU is not helping by watering down CSRD, leaving a precedent that these policies can be watered down. Companies are not, and so it's left them in a position that maybe they aren't as prepared as they should be.
Yeah, that's precisely one of the questions that I had for you because recently India signed its FTA, the free trade agreement with EU, and it's the same conversation that is ongoing based on certain rumors, certain articles that were put out that few of the sectors are going to be left free out of or left out of the CBAM thing. But now that you are given the clarification to that is not actually true. CBAM is here to stay, perhaps, and likely going to impact the lot of ways in which the traditional businesses went around doing its operations. So Dan, let me then ask you the next question. So certain exporters here in India are now quoting dual prices, that is a base price and a CBAM adjusted price. Now, I mean, since you are so much exposed to clients across the world, do you feel that this is a real thing that is happening, or is that hypothetical?
I mean, it is happening, but the question is, what is the CBAM price? Because the CBAM price is so specific to that commodity code, the production route, the precursor, that having a CBAM price for HRC, for example, doesn't really work. Um, uh, most of the clients we speak with are again, if the most of our clients, I'd say, are more on the sophisticated side, and they are not willing to take anyone's CBAM price except their own. And so it
Hmm.
doesn't matter if a supplier comes to them and say, okay, I'm going to sell you my steel for 300 or 400 euros, and there's a 90 euro CBAM price on it. My client's not going to care about that. They're going to say, no, 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 no. The CBAM price is this, and that's the price that their internal team modeled. There's a lot of confusion out there, and a lot of clients are becoming very independent, and they're not listening to, in some cases, PRAs. They're not listening to various associations. They're not listening to their suppliers. They're only trusting themselves because to model any CBAM exposure, you need a lot of specific information on that supplier. And the risks here are so substantial that really the only end answer comes internally from that company because they don't trust anyone else. And so it, the CBAM in itself, the devil's in the details. And so if you give me three different companies that make steel that are all selling HRC, likely they're all going to have different CBAM costs. Um, Potentially, if they're using default values, maybe not. But if they are using default values, the chances of selling in Europe are so low that the possibility there is likely
Yeah.
zero. And so they're going to try and get actual emissions. But then using actual emissions, the spread between the CBAM costs is going to be so substantial that it doesn't make sense broad brushing anything.
So that's a genuine problem there because when each one of the player is coming up with their own CBAM numbers, it becomes extremely difficult to fix it and maybe project the numbers. So I mean, is there a common platform or a sort of a body where this numbers are now being projected, or is there a plan for doing something like this in the
Yeah,
future?
well, so I mean, there are a few startups that are looking at incorporating sort of a supplier to list. I mean, Carbon Chain, from what I know, is doing a great job in this realm. Other companies are considering this, folks like Dewbrink, Sea Bamboo. But at the end of the day, if I speak with a trader, the information they need is what is the CBAM cost going to be per ton of steel, and what is the likelihood I can trust that? Because
Hmm.
if Carbon Chain or any of these companies, and what they're doing is brilliant in my eyes, they're trying to create almost a supplier catalog. The next question let's say the trader or the importer is going to have to identify is, okay, so let's say the actual emissions for this ton of steel in India using X, Y, and Z platform is going to be 90 euros per ton. What are the chances that this installation can get verified for that 90 euros to come to fruition? Because without
Right.
verification, that actual emissions is useless. And so they're again going back to folks like Carbon Chain. They are looking at incorporating some clever ideas there to bridge that gap. But it goes back to the complexity of CBAM, and it goes back to all these moving parts that companies need to have incorporated. What we're seeing more and more and more is suppliers who are starting to kind of wake up and see that CBAM is, in most cases, going to be the deciding factor if they get business or not in Europe. And how they're responding to that's quite interesting. Some suppliers are looking at decarbonization radically, but that's going to take years. Some suppliers are looking at how they can circumvent CBAM. Some suppliers are, as I mentioned earlier, looking at trying to cover the CBAM costs themselves to win contracts. And so the economics and the dynamics of how CBAM is coming into commerce is really interesting. And it's very fluid because as again, CBAM is changing all the time. So these suppliers' strategies need to change with it. And that's really what we do day to day. And we help companies stay abreast of what's going on, not just so they can, understand and read policy easier, but look at how they can negotiate better within their clients for CBAM or EU ETS or all of this.
Sounds extremely complicated, and we know it is complicated. This is such a topic which is quite advanced. And Dan, I mean, just sort of curiosity, because when we talk about decarbonization, because that's the only solution that is long term, that can possibly make the products much more competitive in the long run, right? Because the cost of CBAM, the cost of carbon is only going to go up, given the historical data there, unless there is a big crisis that kind of pops up sometime in the future. But what is a likely timeline that you're considering for these complexities to be simplified? 5 years, 10 years?
Well, the complexity of the CBAM will always remain. The way we view it is it's going to increase because let's right now if I'm an Indian steel producer, maybe I don't know, maybe 40% of my 30% of my, maybe even if that, steel production goes to Europe. Right. Okay. So CBAM matters. It's quite big, of course, but I still have other markets to sell into. Okay, so then we fast forward 5 years from now. Let's say the US creates its own BCA, or let's say South Korea creates their own border carbon adjustment, or Australia came out this morning. Frank Jotza, the chap leading the Australian Safeguards Carbon Leakage Review, reported that the BCA is probably the most optimal solution for Australia at this time, border carbon adjustment. And so, we're going to see a future with more CBAMs all over the world. And so, the idea of the complexity of CBAM right now is actually almost relatively simple because there's just one.
One area.
Exactly, there's just one. You can put your eggs in that basket, focus on it. But let's say in 3 years from now, we have the EU CBAM, we have the UK CBAM, we have the Australian CBAM. Let's say we have the Canadian CBAM. Now we have four, right? And so the complexity there multiplies by 4 because likely these CBAMs aren't going to be the same.
Yeah.
The way the EU CBAM deals with actual emissions could be different than how the UK or the Australian or the you look at the domino effect here, and you look at the complexity, it's going to multiply. And so that's why, kind of like when the transition period started back in 2023, we kept telling our clients, upskill, get switched on this. This is going to happen. It's going to be really important. And they kind of drag their feet. Now they have to wake up. And I'm having the same message with my clients, but not just looking at the EU CBAM, but other arenas. Upskill. Look at what is the cost of carbon? Where is it going? How are they different? How is the South Korean emissions trading system different than the EU's emissions trading system? What does that matter? And so you kind of go into that realm, and we have to upskill. We have to continually upskill. And the complexity increases, and the need for advice and clarity increases, and that's really the front lines we're working on, and that's where I see the future going.
So, given that now we are dealing with one CBAM, perhaps in the future we will have more regions coming up with its own CBAM, some form of carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which will add to the complexity. but that's likely the way where the world is headed, at least by the looks of it. Dan, thank you so much. You have given a great insight into the problem and the complexities of CBAM and the likely implications it will have. Now we'll switch gears and we'll move to the second subtopic, which is the India's financial exposure and the market distortions. We'll take up a few examples just to understand what is the likely implications of the CBAM on India's financial markets. So, uh, give me a concrete numbers for a mid-sized steel mill, say 500,000 tons per year, 30% of it going to EU. What is their annual CBAM liability at the current prices? If you were to just put some figures there. I understand it is very
Couple,
difficult, but roughly.
couple million euros, maybe 10 plus million euros. 2026, if I import 100,000 tons of steel into the EU, if I'm using default values, likely over 10 million euros. If I'm using actual emissions, maybe a couple. Well, again, if I'm using actual emissions, then it could very well. I could have no CBAM costs, but likely, look, it would be in the millions. We have, yeah, it'd be quite substantial.
That's a quite high number. So the only solution that is available right now as part of the financial products is hedging. Is that what you're indicating at?
I mean, there's a few realms really. So, if I look from a structural perspective, how if I'm an Indian company, how I'd want to manage my CBAM exposure, I'd want a multivariate approach. So
Mhm.
obviously, you decarbonize, you hedge, and you lobby. You lobby the Indian government to get in a robust cost of carbon that can be used as an effective cost of carbon under Article 9, getting a rebate. You ask the government to then subsidize your decarbonization. So that goes into point number one. And so while you're doing that, you're also decarbonizing, you're trying to raise funds to, again, decarbonization is really bloody expensive. I mean, we're hundreds of millions of euros to go from BOF to EAF or fuel switch. And it's you need money to do that. And so that's why, you kind of have to do all this together. You have to go and talk to your government, try and get funding for it. Which is successful. I mean, what 3 weeks ago, India announced quite a large CCUS package. I forgot the exact number, maybe 600 million
Yeah, around
dollars.
40,000 crores. That's the number there. So you mentioned three aspects. One is invest into decarbonization itself. The
Hmm.
second route that you mentioned is hedging, and the
Yep.
third route is for the governments to come up with some or
Yeah.
lobby for internal carbon pricing.
Yeah. And then, looking at those three routes, you do have options. I mean, again, some of our clients are exploring other ones, exploring new markets, for example. Um, so there are realms that you can look to manage your risk and exposure to CBAM. But broadly speaking, those are the three immediate reactions to CBAM we're seeing from companies, but most of them take a while. The only one that you can do overnight is hedge. But
Mhm.
the other two, decarbonization and get an effective cost of carbon, is going to take years and years and years and years. And so what are you going to do for 2026? What are you going to do for 2027? And that's where more immediate reactions come in, predominantly hedging in our case. But again, if you give me 10 of my clients, I'm going to give you 10 different ways of responding to CBAM. It's very circumstantial to that company.
Very interesting. But again, I mean, it would give ideas to the listeners to understand how to mitigate the risks here. But the immediate thing for most companies here is a capital, right? Because as you rightly mentioned, this is a capital intensive, cost intensive. Decarbonization is extremely expensive, and it's not a short term goal. It is a long term goal. It takes 10, 15 years
And
to make the switch.
oftentimes it's not profitable. I mean, if I look at the in Europe, there has not been a single CCUS project done that doesn't rely on some kind of government subsidy. And
Subsidy.
the reason is because from a private perspective, it's not profitable. If I look at, for example, hydrogen prices when it comes to steel, if I look at all of the decarbonization routes, oftentimes they just don't make economic sense as of right now. Either you need a cost of carbon high enough to incorporate that marginal abatement cost curve, or you need subsidization. And
Yeah.
so, and we do see various. I mean, when you look at the idea of how you decarbonize a society, you typically have the carrot or the stick approach, which is carrot. Look at the IRA in America. You have subsidization, and then you have stick, which is the cost of carbon. Some countries can use both, but if
Mhm.
I'm a country that doesn't have much capital to begin with, if I'm a country that is very industry reliant, it's going to be difficult to decarbonize whichever way I look at it, and that's sadly a lot of the cases in a lot of the developing countries we speak with.
Yeah, that's a brute, honest reality of today. But this is something I think most businesses have to deal with. And then India, as we speak, is also coming up with its own internal. I mean, just like how we have the ETS, we are also talking about CCTS, which is a trading scheme for India, and we have started monitoring some of the carbon intensive or energy intensive companies with their annual emissions and monitoring them as we speak. But again, when the discussion about the FTA happened, the very pointer that we discussed prior to this, the exemption from CBAM. Is being discussed, but so what are your thoughts on this, Dan? Because India coming up with its own internal carbon pricing and seeking a rebate from CBAM. How do you see this playing out?
Well, I mean, it's tough because we're still waiting on an implementing act that should come out in Q1 2026 on what the European Commission deems as an effective cost of carbon. When we have Article 9, we have Article 2, Clause 27 of the EU CBAM, which provides some of the guardrails on what that cost would look like. But there's a lot of
Mhm.
more details we're missing. And so within that implementing act, we'll get much more information, and then we can take a look at the Indian carbon market with a much more clear lens. From a broad perspective, this is what the European Commission has wanted. They want countries to respond similarly like India is doing, with looking at a cost of carbon. The details will be discussed, of course, in the implementing act, but from a broader perspective, this is great news. Great news from both a European Commission perspective, a Indian industrial perspective, as well as a global perspective looking to mitigate climate change. At the end of the day, that's why CBAM exists, right? The second goal of the CBAM is to incentivize trading partners to incorporate a cost of carbon. First one, of course, is to protect against carbon leakage, and the third one is to help the EU achieve its NDC. And so,
Mhm.
in that realm, Europe's very happy with India, and well, without knowing the details of that implementing act, we don't know how happy. We don't know if that carbon market will be deemed as an effective cost. We don't know a lot of details as that's still waiting, but it's definitely a space to keep an eye out on.
Great. One of the problem that India is yesterday facing is given the access to capital, because the bigger firms manage to absorb the capital or the cost, while the mid scale and the small scale industries find it extremely difficult. Let me put this question across. So let's compare two types of mills: a large integrated producer like Jindal Steelworks or Hindalco versus a mid-market MSME, a micro small scale industry. Same CBAM burden per ton. Why does a bigger JSW survive and MSME doesn't?
I mean, again, it's a great question. Without knowing the specific embedded emissions of those plants, it's tough to
Mhm.
understand the response and how someone's going to impact them. And from a wider perspective, you're saying some smaller companies be a bit more risk tolerant to strategies for CBAM, while larger
Yeah.
companies.
Larger companies manage to absorb the risk, while the smaller mid-sized companies find it extremely challenging to absorb the risk. So
Yeah.
one is absolutely the problem area is the capital itself. But my underlying question again is, what are the ways or what are the mitigations that the small and the mid-sized companies can take to address this very problem?
So, I mean, again, to give you an example, so some of our clients are state-owned, and they're really, really, really risk adverse. They do not want to do anything too quickly. They don't want to move too quickly. On the other hand, we have some clients who are smaller, maybe private owned, and they have a bit more risk tolerance. And so what they might do, and give you an example, right now the EUA price is around 72 euros. About 20 days ago, it was around 93. And so
Hmm.
they might, and if they're switched on, if they're sophisticated, they might buy on a forward basis 5 years of their CBAM exposure right now at a price of 72 euros. And they lock that price in. And let's say EUAs go back up, which is what they're anticipated to be, that SME steel producer might have a material advantage because they're procuring their CBAM certificates at a substantially lower price. However, that falls into the realm of speculating that prices do go up. And that is the general understanding of the market, but nevertheless, it is still speculation. And so it goes back to risk tolerance, and that risk tolerance typically goes back to the institutional identity of that company. There's some companies we work with that they are the most opposite. They're a synonym of speculation. They do not speculate on anything.
Hmm.
We have other companies who appreciate the situation they're in, and they're willing to take a bit more risk. And as of right now, with an EUA price of 72 euros, some of them see the upside there, and so they might look to hedge. And we have companies in India who have hedged through us their CBAM cost on that basis to look to manage their CBAM cost and hopefully outcompete the big guys who aren't willing to take that risk.
Very interesting. So this hedging as a solution to mitigate risk that you suggested. So who are eligible to make this purchase? Are these only importers who are based in Europe, or can the exporters based in India also make these purchases and lock in
No,
this pricing?
so we offer a product where anyone could buy it. So to give you an example, let's say I'm an Indian exporter. I'm a company who's aware that I need to take some kind of drastic measure to be competitive. So what
Hmm.
I might do is call up Redshaw Advisors and say, can you help me hedge? And we'll say yes, and we'll say we can do this for you. We can sell you something called a virtual CBAM certificate, which is exchangeable on a one-for-one basis to an actual CBAM certificate. And what we can
Hmm.
do is we can deliver it to you or in this case, your client, the authorized CBAM declarant at any time you want. So here's how this would work in principle. If I was an Indian, and let's say the Indian steel mill, the supplier, maybe I buy 100,000 virtual CBAM certificates, which equals 10 years of my CBAM demand. Uh,
Hmm.
um, and so I buy it at a price of 72 euros and I lock it in now. Over the next 10 years, whenever I'm trying to bid for contracts within Europe, and let's say my European, trader, my client, is comparing me to one of the larger Indian steel mills, I have a trick up my sleeve. I can tell
Yeah.
that Indian or that European company, if you buy my steel, I will cover the CBAM certificate cost for you. And what I can do is I can physically deliver those CBAM certificates into your CBAM trader portal through Redshaw Advisors. So that Indian steel mill would, let's say, send 10,000 official actual CBAM certificates at the price they paid. Let's say they hedged today at 72 euros, and that CBAM certificate would land into the CBAM trader portal of the entity actually buying the steel in Switzerland or Germany. And as a result of that, that Indian mill has now a competitive advantage that they can do quite well. Now, that does involve, again, sophistication. That involves companies to be aware enough on how this mechanism works, on the options available to manage and hedge, to have the
Hmm.
ability to communicate that to the German supplier. Because if, again, you talk about negotiation strategies here, if you're not clear enough in the negotiation strategy when you're discussing with your German supplier that you can actually do this, the carrot up your sleeve might not come across as what you want to come across, which is a saving grace. And so you do need a lot of confidence and competence in CBAM and how this mechanism works to even consider this strategy. But going back to my point earlier, if you're risk tolerant enough, this is a great strategy, and it's something that we're seeing already being used. And it's definitely a USP for some of the companies, the exporting companies we work with.
Very interesting. I mean, given that if a company can lock in the cost of CBAM early on and then use it in the long run, assuming that the price of CBAM is only going to go up, then it definitely may make sense. And but again, these are all speculative measures for those of the listeners who are listening in. This are speculative. Just a disclaimer out there, right?
And but with that being said, I mean, as much as we speculate on the price of CBAM going in, it's also simply just locking the price in. It's exactly how a lot of companies manage their FX, because
Hmm.
the CBAM price is very volatile. And as I mentioned, right now it's 72 euros. 20 days ago, it was 93 euros.
93 euros.
It could go anywhere. And so if I'm a company exposed to CBAM, sometimes I just want to lock that price in so I can negotiate and lock in my profit margin. Because if I have this variable that keeps going up and down, the CBAM cost, how am I supposed to know what is the minimum cost of my ton of steel? my total liability, my ton of steel, so I can manage my profit margin? I don't know because I don't know what that CBAM cost is going to be when I import the ton of steel in Europe in 3 months from now. And so that's why they might want to hedge. And so you hedge for different reasons. Some companies hedge to speculate. I'd say most of our clients hedge to manage the risk, lock it in,
Yes.
which isn't
Yeah.
speculation. It's a risk management strategy they use for FX and freight and everything else.
Very interesting. Dan, let's again switch topics to India's policy response. I think we touched up on this topic in during the conversation itself. That is India coming up with its own CCTS. My question is now about leverage, right? So let me ask this question to you. So what is India's real leverage? What does India have that EU needs such that EU would negotiate on CBAM?
Well, great question. I wish I could answer it, but um, uh, I'd say the question I'd say most back to is why would the EU want to negotiate on CBAM? Because if the
Mm,
EU bends CBAM to, let's say, India or any country for this matter, that's going to send a precedent, a signal to every other country in the world to try and get an exemption. Very simply speaking, it is a rule of no exemptions no matter what the case. I mean, if I'd argue the one country that really needs an exemption right now is Ukraine, and Europe is not giving them an exemption on CBAM because they don't want to set
mm,
a precedent. That precedent's very dangerous. And so they would be looking at using a white and black approach to CBAM. As of right now, again, this could change very quickly. The policy is very fluid. But that is the logic behind why they would not be willing to give an exemption to anyone. I mean, look at some of the rhetoric over on America. I mean, we have a very interesting situation going on between the Trump administration and Europe when it comes to tariffs.
mhm.
Um, Europe didn't bend on CBAM for America. They haven't bent for anyone. Uh, there is not a single country really that has any substantially different arrangement under CBAM. I know under the FTA, for example, there was some rhetoric that Europe would provide specific technical consultations to India on helping them with their carbon market to get that effective cost of carbon under Article 9. But we've seen similar rhetoric that the EU has provided to other countries, namely America, actually, about 9 months ago. And so the possibility of any kind of exemption, I'd say, is quite low.
Quite low. Okay, that's definitely something that most of the listeners would take it with a pinch of salt, because most exporters here in India are hoping for some form of exemptions. Though there was an initial transformative phase the CBAM entered, many thought that this would simply go away. But now that it is entering the definitive phase, the same discussion is happening all over again. That
If
at least
if
uh,
I had to
you
say
know,
one thing, I'd say don't plan an exemption.
yeah.
Um, if I was an Indian male, and my advise my clients, we work with very large clients in India, and we tell them, do not plan on an exemption under the EU CBAM.
Thank you for stating it out very, very clearly out there, Dan. So Dan, if you were to make recommendations to a mid-sized or an MSME here in India on their immediate steps to consider, of course, you have suggested three key risk mitigation strategies that they could consider. That is, invest into decarbonization, looking for a lobbying for internal carbon pricing here in India, and the third being hedging as an option that they could consider. But if you were to make immediate recommendation to an MSME or a SME based out of India on their decarbonization journey, where would you recommend them to start?
Great question, and I'd say the very first point of call is knowledge in education. If I if I was an Indian steel company and I put 100 if I put 100 million euros into decarbonizing my electricity so I can manage my CBAM cost, that'd be
Hmm.
not a good investment because as of right now, CBAM doesn't cover scope 2 for steel, right? And so, you need to take a step back and look at how does the CBAM work? What is the possibility of other CBAMs covering the same thing? Understand and have your confidence to a level where you can then make your risk management decisions and then decide how you want to move forward. And so that's one of the things that we've been really stressing with our clients, which is education, 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 education. Um, Broadly speaking, most of the clients we work with in India are phenomenal. they're some of the best clients we have. They're really, really interested in looking to improve their situation. They're really, really interested in looking to stay competitive. And it's wonderful. And I'd say keep pressing the gas on education. Join as many new elements of CBAM in your strategy as you can. I always say, try and find the things you can't Google, because that's really where the value lies in CBAM. What is the price of CBAM for your good? Actual emissions versus default values. What is the possibility of you getting verified? How can you hedge that cost and retrospectively adjust it when you get actual emissions? How can you pass that through when you're negotiating to your supplier to stay more competitive? What are your competitors doing in India? What are their strategies for CBAM? Do you want to copy them or do you not want to copy them, and why? All of those questions are kind of where I'd start first before you do anything at all in respect to risk management or decarbonization.
Great. So the primary suggestion that you have is educate yourself on CBAM. So
Yep.
my follow-up to that is, do we have a single portal or a library where the CEOs or the C-suite level executives can get information on CBAM? Of course, I know there is a learning material that is available online, but other than that, is there anything more that they can get this information from?
So you have this is one of the biggest issues of CBAM is right here. You need multiple tiers of knowledge. The CEO doesn't need to know the measurement approach of CBAM versus they don't need to understand the technicalities of it. That's the engineers or the sustainability team.
Mm-hmm.
The CEO needs to understand, what is this going to do to their business from a competitive perspective? Where do they need to put capital at, right? And to do that, they need certain information that, let's say, the sustainability engineer doesn't need to know. And the sustainability engineer needs to know the information that the CEO doesn't need to know. And so there's a bunch of webinars out there that are really good at one silo. Let's say, how do you acquire actual emissions? If I'm using my steel production route, what is the perimeters, right? What's the system boundaries? Does the CEO need to know that? Probably not. There's other webinars that, and this is really what we're focused on, which is the financial and strategy element of CBAM. We do not, in my clients, I don't touch at all on complying with CBAM or reporting it or measuring it. And that's why we work with great partners who do. And so you need different expertises under CBAM because it's so complicated and it's so wide. I've been following this regime for years and years and years and years. And even my full-time job, I have black holes of elements of if a fertilizer company came to me and they said, Dan, I need to use a EMS system to manage my CBAM calculations, I'm going to scratch my head and call it with my partners. But and that's great because I know what I know and I know what I don't know. But imagine someone who has 1/10 of their day looking at CBAM. How do they manage all of that? This is to give you a simple I think if you combine all of the CBAM legislation, you're looking at north of 3,000 or 4,000 pages of EU documents, right? CEO doesn't need to know that. CEO might need to know 9 pages within all of that. But what are those 9 pages? And that's really where, the conversation should be held. It's not quantity of information, it's quality. That's where I would say.
So focus on the quality of information that you're looking out on CBAM, and depending on the kind of position that you're
There's
in.
1,000 webinars on timeline of CBAM, what CBAM is, what carbon leakage is, that's what people should have known in 2023. The realm of really what's important now, in my eyes, is how is this going to impact your price per steel? What are the ways you can lower that cost? Those 2 questions. Focus on those 2 questions. Everything else, of course, is important, but everything else is what your sustainability team should be looking at. If you're a CEO or a head of sales, how much per ton will the premium be for my HRC, and what can I do to lower that? The 2 questions you need to touch on.
Thank you for stating it very, very clearly. That makes the searches perhaps much more easier and clearer for somebody who's listening in. Dan, let me ask you one last question. So we have covered quite a lot today. Burden allocation, India's policy responses, financial strategy, supply chain restructuring. So let me ask you a more pressing question. 3 weeks into, roughly not 3 weeks. Now we are at 4 or 5 weeks into live CBAM phase. What's the single most important thing that business leaders in India should understand today?
CBAM is not going to go away. CBAM is going to expand. We're going to see CBAM expand vertically, so more CN codes covered under the sectors, and horizontally. CBAM is going to get much more expensive. If you think a price per ton of 300 euros is bad, forecast 5 years from now, an exemption will not come. Preparation is what is needed, not just superficial preparation, but structural preparation. That is the advice I would give to anyone watching this podcast.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for stating it out clearly, throwing light into areas that are so complex. But yet, I believe we have tried to simplify it as much as possible for our listeners. An absolute privilege to have you on the show. It was a pleasure talking to you, Dan.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you for having me.
Likewise. For those of you who are listening in and want to reach out to Dan, we will drop his link to his LinkedIn profile in the description. And of course, you could write to him on LinkedIn perhaps, or maybe drop in an email if you have any inquiries. And specifically looking for hedging solutions, perhaps he's a person that you're going to talk to, right? So Dan, thank you so much. Wishing you a lovely day ahead.
Pleasure is mine. You too. Cheers.
Right.